Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Wiener Holocaust Library online event. I'm Barbara Warnock of the Wiener Holocaust Library, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all here tonight and to welcome Nathaniël Kunkeler to give us this fascinating talk. So just a kind of few words of introduction before I hand over to him. So this event is part of the Wiener Holocaust Library's event series for our This Fascist Life exhibition, which looks at interwar fascist movements and the experiences of members of interwar fascist movements across Europe in the interwar period. And so as part of the project that we've had to produce this exhibition, we have been looking at some fascist movements, perhaps in countries where people don't associate fascist movements so much, such as in this case, perhaps to some extent, you know, Sweden and Holland compared to, say, the more famous examples in Germany and Italy and so on. So just to say that this event is being recorded and it'll be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. There'll be a chance for questions at the end. The audience are all muted, so if you have any questions, if you could put them in the chat and I'll be able to field them to Nathaniël tonight. So we're going to just switch on the live transcription, which you can turn on and off should you need to use that. Just to say, with the live transcription, it's not completely accurate, so it may sometimes come up with strange ideas about what we're saying. Nathaniel's sound quality tonight isn't great, so he's aware of that, so he's going to try and sort of speak up. But just to say, we are aware of that and we've experimented with different things, and I think it's just going to be one of those, you know, downsides occasionally that you get with online events. So just to introduce our speaker tonight, so Dr. Nathaniël Kunkeler is a historian of fascism and the far right in interwar Europe and a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre for Research on Right-Wing Extremism, CREX, at the University of Oslo. They did their PhD at Cambridge University on the subject of Swedish and Dutch fascism, which has now been published as a monograph with Bloomsbury Academic, Making Fascism in Sweden and the Netherlands, Myth Creation and Respectability 1931 to 40. They are currently working on a research project about military volunteers and the transnational counter-revolutionary right in Northwestern Europe 1917 to 40. So I'll hand over to Nathaniël now, who I think is going to share some slides with us and talk us through this subject. So Nathaniël.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Good evening, everyone. From Oslo, sharing my PowerPoint. I hope everyone can see that. Very good. Right, yes, so this will be very much focused on interwar Europe. I'd already seen from some of the interest that I've gauged that, you know, people are very interested in sort of the Second World War and what fascists were doing in that time. But that's not what I'll be talking about tonight necessarily, although I'll be happy to answer questions about it in Q&A afterwards. So I'll just get right into it. So between January 1933 and April 1940, the Swedish National Socialist Workers' Party, Nationella Socialistiska Arbetarpartiet, or NSAP for short, though small in size, organized hundreds of meetings around the country every year. The party leader, a non-commissioned officer from the Stockholm artillery, Sven-Olof Lindholm, personally organized and led many of these, typically on one of his famous summer propaganda tours that took him all around the country to local branches to speak. In his diary, which he kept at the time, he described these, and together with party correspondence and feedback and newspaper reports, they allow us to reconstruct what a Swedish fascist meeting might have been like. Overall, it seems fair to say that they were not particularly impressive, even with the party leader himself present. Usually they featured the speaker standing on top of a box or something, the back of a truck, or in some cases literally a ditch in the road. And he, and it was indeed always that he would be speaking, might be then flanked by blue, yellow swastika flags, and perhaps in some cases there were spirited party songs celebrating the eventual victory of fascism in Sweden. And when this happened in the public space, as with all outdoor meetings, there were no uniforms, since the wearing of political uniforms in public had been banned already in 1933. In short, this manifestation of fascism was not a spectacle. And the image here on the right, you can see in the quite early Swedish fascist or National Socialist meeting, which doesn't look particularly remarkable from this image. And one of the things I enjoy about this, you can actually see there in the middle of the image actually what appears to be a pig sort of grazing, which I thought was quite revealing about sort of character that these meetings could have. Instead, not a spectacle. Now in the Netherlands, meetings of the National Socialist movement, the Nationaal Socialistische Beweging, or NSB, which was founded by Anton Mussert in 1931, were not necessarily any different. As in Sweden, party uniforms had been banned early on, and even the use of flags or insignia was very heavily restricted by law. The leader, Mussert himself, was a short, balding civil engineer in water management and did not make for a particularly impressive figure at large party meetings, often with long-winded and dry speeches that frequently dwelt for too long on policy details. Now, while there was quite a variety of different sorts of meetings and rallies and all kinds of fascist gatherings organized by these two fascist parties throughout this decade, and particularly in the Netherlands, they were often more of a particularly patriotic lecture, complete with Q&A sessions. And of course, there was a chance for the whole thing to be thrown into disarray by left-wing protesters. So my point is that fascist movements in the Netherlands and Sweden in this period were a far cry from the kind of imagery we are used to, which circulated widely in Europe at the time. As seen by this particular image from the famous / notorious Nuremberg rallies in Nazi Germany. Fascist Italy and later Nazi Germany were very well known for their propaganda and these spectacles of serried ranks of uniformed fascists, liturgical rituals of devotion to the Duce or Führer, and militaristic manifestations of heroic masculinity, such as seen most famously in Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda documentary, The Triumph of the Will. And indeed, audiences in Sweden and the Netherlands back then were already very well aware of these images. And needless to say, the realities of Italian fascism and German Nazism contrasted very starkly with the images created by their propaganda machinery. But those images circulated very widely and more effectively, perhaps, than actually accurate reports on the lived reality of fascist rule. So their spectacular dimension was widely acknowledged. And in fact, what struck outsiders was precisely the incomparable scale and grandeur of events like the Nuremberg rallies in particular, something which was simply not found in the political life of the small democracies. In the words of the aforementioned Swedish fascist leader Sven-Olof Lindholm, who visited one of the Nuremberg rallies actually on several occasions, but this is from 1929, and I quote, "And it was then a perhaps mile-long column of members came, first and foremost SA troops from different parts of the country, with their standards and flags, masses of viewers, there were raised tribunes on the side and stood masses of people, and in the windows and on the roofs and waving with flags, shouting and screaming. It was something altogether indescribable. Something like that simply doesn't happen in Sweden." End quote. The quoted question is from an interview Lindholm did with an historian in the early 1980s. It was evidently then still very much impressed by the experience he had half a century earlier. So these highly enduring images of fascism remain ubiquitous in the popular understanding of fascism to this day. And already in the 20s and 30s, the Swedish and Dutch fascists had at some level to contest with the circulation of this imagery, and they were presenting their own version of fascism. Naturally, they could never live up to the extremely high bar set by the two main regimes that influenced people's perceptions. After all, the Italian and German fascists in the 30s were operating with the full machinery of the state at their disposal. This, by contrast, the Swedish NSAP and the Dutch NSB commanded party organizations which peaked at about 12 and 50,000 members respectively. Needless to say, the impressions they made were of a very different caliber. Nevertheless, they were not altogether unsuccessful in attracting support, particularly in the Dutch case. The NSB made a real splash in the politics of the Netherlands in the mid-30s, while even the Swedes, with their particularly dismal electoral record, maintained thousands of devotees who stuck with the leader for literally decades in the name of fascism. So my question that I'm operating with here is, so what actually attracted people to Swedish and Dutch fascism in the first place? Sweden and Netherlands of the interwar period, I think, make fascinating case studies for this question. Here we have two liberal democracies that have both managed to stay out of the First World War and who remained as more or less stable liberal democracies throughout the period. Given how much of fascism's success in other countries like Italy, Germany, Austria, Romania or Hungary depended on the legacy of defeat in the First World War or economic and political crisis in the following years, the fascists in Sweden and the Netherlands were facing a rather tall task. But this was very much a new age of mass democracy in both countries, with the franchise being hugely expanded immediately at the end of the First World War in both cases. While in Sweden, the fascists were effectively faced with what turned out to be the great era of the rise of social democracy. It was in the early 30s that the Social Democrats entered government there, and they could not effectively managed to remain in government for decades afterwards. In fact, they managed to obtain absolute majorities in parliament quite soon after. By contrast, in the Netherlands, fascists had to face harshly restrictive conservative governments. The ruling parties in the Netherlands for most of the interwar period were predominantly very conservative Christian, Catholic, as well as Calvinist parties, which were frequently very intolerant of any kind of fascist violence or threats of violence. Said in both cases, political uniforms were banned early on in the 1930s, as were paramilitary wings, between a very popular and a very recognizable image of fascism in places like Italy and Germany, of course. So, nevertheless, politically, and so Europe still didn't have any kind of exceptional islands of complete isolation from sort of trends and waves that swept around the continent. And here too, in these two countries, there were good reasons for the emergence of fascism. But one of the most important is the German Revolution of November 1918, which inaugurated the Weimar Republic in the Netherlands, just across the border, at which point the Dutch socialist leader, Peter Troelstra, kind of believed this was the time for a regime change in the Netherlands as well, and called for Dutch workers to revolt and overthrow the bourgeois government. This episode has since tellingly been labelled Troelstra's mistake, as the Social Democratic Party did not heed its leader's calls, but it did massively exacerbate right-wing suspicions of the socialist revolutionary tendencies. Indeed, in the wake of this event, alongside communist revolts in Berlin in January 1919, civil militias were formed in cities all over the Netherlands. It was a sort of organized paramilitary reaction, which could potentially prove to be an effective basis for new kinds of far-right politics. So the Bolshevik menace was here too one of the most potent and abiding mobilizing images for the right. And indeed, what you can see on the image here on the left, it's a propaganda poster produced by the Amsterdam civil militias, encouraging people to support the lawful authorities before it's too late. And this rather murderous-looking figure that's been not very subtly coded as Bolshevik. Likewise, the image from the later 30s, propaganda poster produced by the Roman Catholic State Party, which was the threat of both communism and fascism. That's what the symbol in the top right corner there signifies. At the same time, the Netherlands also suffered from very divisive social political structures, specifically pillarization. Sort of phenomena where a lot of society was organized around basically the churches and to a lesser extent the socialist parties. So that each church had effectively its own party, its own newspapers, its own clubs, its own trade unions, which meant that people tended to be very much stick within their own sphere and not really interact with the rest of the population very much. And people were also quite obedient in their voting patterns to these different pillars of society. This then also caused parliamentary difficulties along with it, as the ruling conservative Christian parties couldn't actually form an effective coalition government anymore in the 1920s across their confessional divides, particularly after they had obtained their shared goal of state-funded religious education during World War I. Now, in Sweden, fears of Bolshevism were also very prevalent, and indeed, cities like Stockholm saw powerful shows of force by socialists following the German Revolution again. But an even greater source of fear was the civil war, which broke out in neighboring Finland in January 1918. There, shortly after the coup in Russia, where the Bolsheviks seized power, in November 1917, conservatives and socialists armed themselves and started an open war for power in the wake of the collapse of the Tsarist regime in Finland. The general of the counter-revolutionary White Army, Gustav Mannerheim, did a great deal to spread fears of Bolshevism abroad, partly by describing his opponents as a contagious virus that had to be stopped in Finland at all costs. So fears of revolution in Scandinavia generally as well remained alive and well for over a decade, not the least because of the continued revolutionary rhetoric from social democrats and communists, as well as periodic strikes all over Scandinavia. And also it's not a picture that's particularly limited to Scandinavia either. In 1928, the Swedish Social Democrats and Communists united during this election as the Labour Party, Arbeiderpartiet, which inaugurated what's subsequently been called the Cossack elections, alluding to the highly Russophobic fear of revolution that marked so much of the electoral propaganda from the right that year, which is what you can see in the propaganda image here, which was produced by the Swedish National Union, which was an offshoot of the Conservative Party that later turned in a very fascist direction indeed, particularly in the early 30s. There were also other sources of right-wing grievance, most importantly cuts to the military budget in the mid-20s by the then Liberal government. Indeed, it was precisely in the military as well as other establishment circles that there was a prevalence of both authoritarian as well as critically anti-Semitic attitudes, so that there existed a lot of potential backers for fascism in Sweden. People who felt threatened by this new age of mass democracy and also, as would turn out, the rise of social democracy. So it shouldn't be surprising that fascist groups emerged in these countries too. In the Netherlands, this was initially around a periodical called Catholic Statecraft, which came about in the early 20s and then very much inspired by the March on Rome in Italy, turned fascist basically, as well as parties like the Union of Actualists, which we can see a propaganda poster on the left here, and the Basin, the Union or League of the Broom, which you can see on the far right here. In Sweden, fascism first came with the National Socialist Freedom Movement, Nationalsocialistiska Frihetsrörelsen or NSFF, in 1924. It's quite noticeable that fascism in Sweden first actually arrived under the moniker of National Socialism before anything else. We can see the first leader of this party, Birger Furugård, here in the middle. He was a veterinary surgeon in the west of Sweden in Värmland. So in the very small Netherlands, these different fascist groups could be very quarrelsome and didn't get very far and ended up being sort of derided as dilettantes and amateurs in politics. Whereas in Sweden, where these groups were much more dispersed and often to be more regional, so specifically localized to Day in Värmland, there was less controversy between the parties, but initially at least, but they didn't get anywhere. Interestingly, neo-Nazis in Värmland still commemorate the Furugård to this day. So only in 1926 in Sweden did a party was actually a fascist party with nationwide reach emerge. This was Sveriges fascistiska kamporganisation, the Swedish fascist combat organization or militant organization, if you will, SFKO, which was initially bankrolled by Elof Eriksson, who's former leader of the within the Agrarian League. It started out in Stockholm, mostly as a reaction against the Liberal government's budget cuts for the military, and as such it indeed saw the heavy involvement of military figures. It grew eventually to the size of perhaps some 7,000 members, so it's very difficult to actually get accurate figures on this. At the top of this party was Konrad Hallgren, who's the man you see on the picture. You can immediately see that they have this military styling, but they're already using the swastika as a fascist symbol in Sweden as well, and to highlight the relevance of the idea of the Bolshevik men as standing next to a poster that says "Death to Communism." He himself had actually volunteered in the German Imperial Army during the First World War, and allegedly also in part of the Russian White Army during the Russian Civil War, although it's not clear how true that is. But there's a reminder of how basically no country was too peripheral to escape the influence and effects of these really great upheavals that were happening elsewhere in Europe. The party also has Sven Hegengren, who was an officer in the Swedish Army and did surveillance on communist groups for the military. Was also at some point involved with smuggling guns from Germany to Sweden for a paramilitary organization in Stockholm. and Geneva was very much inspired by the Finnish counter-revolutionary paramilitaries in building this organization. And lastly, and most importantly for the following decades, at the top of Sven-Olof Lindholm was this young non-commissioned officer from the Stockholm Artillery Regiment, was a nationalist with sort of penchant for social issues, as well as a love of reading. The SFKO members wore black shirts in honor of fascist Italy and drove around in trucks spreading anti-Semitic propaganda and steadily advocated an authoritarian state, possibly under the King Gustav V, and of course naturally with powerful military. In 1929, Swedish fascists from SFKO were invited to the Nuremberg rallies, as was Birger Frudegaard of the aforementioned National Socialist Freedom Movement, which was still going, well, not strong, but still going anyway. And this invitation prompted a sea change. At the encouragement of the German Nazis, it seems, they actually merged their parties together with several other fascist groups, and out of it came the Swedish National Socialist Party, Svenska Nationalsocialistiska Partiet, SNSP. This led to a very brief moment of unity under Frudegaard, with Lindholm as the deputy leader, as well as editor of the party newspaper. However, the moment was not to last. The SNSP did not do very well in its first elections in which it participated, to say the least, and electoral defeat always seems to bring out all the tensions within a political organization. And there were quite a few of these in the SNSP. Firstly, there were divisions between left and right in the party, with especially the more left-leaning Lindholm standing against what he perceived to be a very classist and bourgeois fascist right, as well as personal differences between Frudegaard and Lindholm, particularly over the work ethic and Frudegaard's alcoholism. But things came rapidly to a head. Lindholm seized the membership files and started a breakaway movement, the National Socialist Workers' Party, the NSAP, on the 15th of January 1933. And local branches were forced to make a choice. And generally it seems that the more sort of youthful, dynamic and activist Lindholm managed to win over the majority to make the largest fascist party in Sweden by 1935. One quote has it from a secret police report found in the archives. To explain this, the police officer wrote, "The Lindholm party is after all a party of youth, which particularly works among the youth, which is why it will surely emerge victorious from the battle between the various different National Socialist currents in this country." And so indeed it seemed for a while. The story in the Netherlands is a very different one. It starts really with the so-called Belgian Treaty in 1925, which would regulate Belgian access to Dutch canals, which caught the attention of, among other people, an ambitious civil engineer, the aforementioned Anton Mussert, who worked as head of water management in the Utrecht State Administration. He was very used to designing bridges and canals. He was a member of the Liberal Conservative Party for a while and generally enjoyed reading national histories and technical manuals and that sort of thing. Incidentally, he was also married to his aunt, which was a distinctly unusual move for a future fascist leader. He volunteered for the military, which was deemed too short and constitutionally delicate, though he did eventually end up in the Army Reserve. Now, this treaty caught his attention because a lot of nationalists, spearheaded by Mussert, took this to be effectively a betrayal of Dutch sovereignty and derided it as something of a Dutch Treaty of Versailles, which is a really quite phenomenal exaggeration of its political importance. But they did have it successfully repealed. The minister in question had to resign, and briefly Mussert was in the political limelight, which clearly whetted his appetite for politics, and in the next few years, we see him taking an interest in the fascist wave that was making such a splash in Europe at the time, including the little parties in the Netherlands that I talked about earlier. Indeed, by December 1931, Mussert, together with a colleague from this National Committee Against the Treaty, founded the NSB. There we are, one of the earliest forms of its headquarters. It was very much, as the name implies, inspired by the rising National Socialist movement in Germany, and indeed it did take the German Nazi Party program as its starting point. But it was also strongly influenced by Italy. Its lightest ideas of a corporatist economy, and it also adopted its black shirt aesthetic. But it must be said that while these regime influences are very obvious, it was perhaps even more strongly rooted in Dutch conservative examples, not least, for instance, the colonial administration of the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, where a reactionary authoritarian Governor General ruled with an iron fist and was certainly very concerned with national unity in the name of military defense. Also, it's important to note the NSB was initially not officially anti-Semitic. It rejected anti-Semitism explicitly in its first party program and said that what it tried to do was stay in touch with, stay in line with national history and tradition, declaring that the makeup of the Dutch Empire was one of many races and religions, including Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and Muslims. So there was no place for things like anti-Semitism in the NSB. The reality was rather more complicated. The NSB, especially with that name, inevitably attracted a great many anti-Semites and racists who admired the German Nazi model in particular. But it was also not just rhetoric of respectability. The party did genuinely attract Jewish members for years, and crucially also established actual operating party branches in Indonesia. These branches would actually grow to an impressive size. They saw the extensive involvement from mixed race Indo-European members, and indeed, according to some historians, as many as 70% were of mixed race, though that figure does remain unverified. And these members also donated very heavily to the party, and actually by the mid-30s provided fully 1/3 of all NSB party funding. The subsequent trajectories of the NSB and NSAP diverged very strongly. While both were decidedly on the margins of politics in the respective countries, the NSB was still an order of magnitude more prominent than Lindholm's party was. After spending a year developing the NSB's organization and collecting funding for his party, Mussert launched a party weekly newspaper, Volk en Vaderland, People and Fatherland, and held the first party congress, where Mussert inspected his troops. This brief moment when uniforms were still allowed, he inspected his black uniformed members of the paramilitary Weerbaarheidsafdeling, Defense Department, which at the time was led by the European colonial army veteran Jan Hogewind. The scene attracted derision from the left, who saw in this party congress a mediocre imitation of the Nuremberg rallies in Germany. In papers like the Socialist had Volk made fun of the very small scale of the event, saying this was sort of fascist call to arms, but at a provincial Dutch scale. The conservative right was then more positive, with respectable newspapers like Algemeen Handelsblad, liberal conservative paper, focusing more on Mussert's career background and describing him as a competent civil servant with an organizational mindset, a sort of fresh break from the fascist dilettantes of the 1920s. So perhaps he would be the one to bring fascism to the Netherlands properly. And indeed, the NSB did then rapidly subsume all other fascist parties. By the end of the year, Mussert's movement had attracted thousands of members, and by 1935, the party counted some 50,000 members, actually making it by membership one of the largest parties in the country, just behind the Social Democrats and the Roman Catholic State Party. That year, it also achieved, in some ways, quite remarkable 8% of the vote in the provincial elections, which was a runaway start for effectively a brand new party. And so, for a moment, it seemed like they would break through the pillarized system. And this is one of the things that kept the NSB in the political limelight in Dutch politics for quite a while. Meanwhile, in Sweden, Lindholm's NSAP continued to struggle. The young party leader did work very hard to spread the fascist gospel to Swedish towns and villages far and wide, by traveling the country in propaganda tours and personally helping with the distribution of leaflets, putting up posters and selling issues of the party newspaper. Holding speeches and rallies, going from urban town dwellers in Skåne in the south to Finnish-speaking lumberjack communities in Lapland, but it didn't get them very far. Lindholm was very successful in winning over the old SNSD branches, and indeed the NSAP did take on a very youthful character. The party youth wing, Nordic Youth, Nordisk Ungdom, had several thousand members actually, led by the bold and young Arne Clemensson, participated directly in a lot of party activism. Indeed, a lot of NSAP branches around the country consisted of primarily school youths, which perhaps partially helps explain the disproportionate level of sort of relentless campaigning activity the party managed to pull off. But while the NSB in the Netherlands was achieving almost meteoric growth at this time, the NSAP ultimately failed to achieve the exponential growth it needed to seize Sweden with a revolutionary mass movement, as Lindholm had hoped. Membership figures sort of stalled at a little over perhaps 10,000 members. And at the general elections of 1936, while it was still fighting against several rival fascist groups, they didn't actually manage to net more than 0.7% of the votes. of which the NSAP got 0.6%. Now, the trajectories of the two parties in the second half of the decade was more simpler. While the Swedish fascists increasingly spoke a discourse of struggle and endurance, the Dutch preferred the language of destiny and imminent victory, but their inflated expectations were severely punctured at the 1937 general elections. Some had hoped that they would gain as much as 12, 30, or even 50% of the vote, securing power for the movement at last. But in fact, they actually ended up losing almost half the support they had enjoyed 2 years earlier. Consequences were catastrophic. Many members left Nusset and his party in droves, while the party became even more marginalized as the more fanatical and radical parts remained in greater proportions. Ultimately, it seemed that the NSB had a hardcore of probably not much more than 15,000 members by the end of the decade, at which point Germany invaded the Netherlands in May 1940. While 1937 marked a turning point for the NSB that radicalized the Dutch movement in tandem with increased connections to the German Nazi state as well, Lindholm's NSAP in 1938 had a makeover to moderate its image at least. After really vociferous anti-Semitic agitation for over a decade, Lindholm decided to tone down the rhetoric a bit and revise the party image. The swastika was ditched for the Vasa sheaf of wheat. That's the heraldic symbol of the 16th century Swedish royal family, and the party name was changed to Svensk Socialistisk Samling, or Swedish Socialist Union. The brown shirts became blue shirts, and there was a failed effort to phase out the fascist salute as well. Ideologically, nothing much had changed, but it was hoped that moderating the image could attract a larger range of supporters. However, that proved not to be the case. Some radicals left the party and instead formed a tiny breakaway movement, the Sun Cross, while the rest continued as it always had. When Nazi Germany invaded Norway and Denmark in spring of 1940, some members volunteered to defend the Scandinavian brothers, while many fewer volunteered for the Waffen-SS later on. By the general elections of 1944, SSS support had dropped to 0.1%. But Lindholm soldiered on for a little while longer. Only in 1950 did he throw in the towel and the party was dissolved. Interesting endnote to this is that Lindholm himself gave up on politics for a while until he converted to the left effectively in the 1960s and regularly participating in anti-war protests and the like. He eventually died in 1998. His second wife, whom he married after the Second World War, Vera Szymanski from Germany, then divorced him, and she instead married neo-Nazi party leader Göran Ulriksson. She's actually still very much alive today, frequently getting in trouble for hate speech on a regular basis. So the parties had different but ultimately similar fortunes of utter marginalization and defeat. While the liberal democratic landscape allowed them the necessary leeway to spread their ideas and recruit members, they fundamentally failed to convince any majority that the cause was really so grand and worthy. This brings us back to my central question: what did people actually see in the NSB and the NSAP? It's easy to explain why they failed in electoral terms, to point to other trends that weighed far heavier than the supposed salvation from national crisis or promise of glory, such as, for instance, the great rise of Swedish social democracy in this era, on the back of a successful recovery from the Great Depression, or the stability of the Dutch confessional pillars, which not even the Second World War could break, at least at first. There was the presence of viable alternatives, as well as the mediocrity of the fascist leaders. But to me, the more interesting question, in light of the obvious and unmitigated mediocrity, given the sort of farcical nature of these fascist groups and the lack of feasible political prospects, is why did quite so many still choose them, and why did quite a few remain fanatically devoted to the parties and the leaders through years or even decades of struggle and far-going personal sacrifice? How is it that Lindholm could mobilize his rank and file for years after electoral defeat and sustain the promise of an eventual fascist victory? Why was it that the respectable Nusset, a bourgeois married to his aunt and with a mind for technicalities rather than moving speeches, commanded absolute loyalty from some devotees until the last days of total defeat in 1945? And indeed that some of his allies still believed he was the herald of national salvation years after he was executed in 1946. I think part of the answer lies in myths, the political myths of fascism that these parties generated, which effectively defined the universe which their members inhabited. Myths occupied a crucial place in the fascist politics of Sweden and the Netherlands. But it's important to mind that such political myths are by no means the prerogative of fascism. Here, myths can be understood as sort of moral narratives, not so much fictional as ahistorical, with strong connotations of fantastical, or even more simply as the idealized images made to inspire. These have been exploited for ages in politics in the past, but the new technologies of mass production gave new options, new ways of dramatizing politics in quite spectacular ways. At the beginning of this talk, I already considered one of these fascist myths, such as constructed by the Nuremberg rallies. There's constructed German fascism and the Volksgemeinschaft of the Third Reich as something of incredible grandeur, great power, something embodied by military discipline and order, destined for victory. Where yet other myths, like those of the Dutch or Führer, a man who possessed almost supernatural abilities and a clear vision for the future, supposedly. And surprisingly, in spite of the limited resources at the disposal of the NSB and NSAP, we were not without such myths. And in fact, there was a real desire for them. There's a letter in the archives to Messit, which says, "The masses want a cult of personality. The masses want a symbol. Can zeal really emerge from the daily administration of, for instance, 3 people or triumvirate? And so you too, Messit, must be a symbol for our movement. And the people must not know you. They must not know you as an ordinary mortal. They must only see and hear you on the stage or at the head of the troops." For instance, in Sweden, Lindholm was elevated as a kind of chieftain, first among equals, warrior leader type, who traveled around the great lands of Sweden to spread the gospel. Here, the emphasis was on a special, unbreakable bond between the leader and his troops, who were supposedly unwaveringly devoted to him. At the annual party congress, members came from all over the country, some traveling over 1,000 miles on foot to make it to Stockholm from Lapland to meet their leader. Ritualistically, Lindholm would then enter the halls while a band played "Freedom Lives," the song he had written himself, and the audience shouted things like "Hell Lindholm." The party newspaper at one point wrote that an outsider cannot understand the heartfelt contact that exists in a moment such as this between leader and followers. But we know that this natural, voluntary solidarity, founded on the kinship of souls, only exists among us. So the two parties managed to lead in myths of Messit and Lindholm really quite differently. Not surprisingly, given the contrast between the blonde and blue-eyed military man that was Lindholm and the small, perfectly bourgeois Messit. But they were conversely very similar in their development of a militaristic subculture, which systematically constructed fascists as soldiers in a great army. This was a very prominent and persistent feature of fascism from the outset, going back to the symbolic association of Italian fascism with war veterans in the early 20s, and it was reflected most obviously in the ubiquitous party uniform, typically a black or a brown shirt. Indeed, the NSB explicitly invoked Italian fascism in its choice of a black shirt as the party uniform, acknowledging the Italian regime's role in leading what it called a political resurrection of Europe. The fascist aesthetic of the shirt is well known, but rather less observed is the members' private feelings about the fascist uniform. They allowed people from all parts of society, from shop clerks to school students to stenographers and the unemployed, to feel like they were a part of a great army on a spectacular mission to save the nation. Correspondingly, the archival record shows many members felt profound attachment to the uniform paraphernalia, with members, for instance, insisting on wearing their shirts even at times when this was, for instance, prohibited by law, or pushing the party leadership to allow them to wear specific items that were particularly popular, like the leather shoulder straps or military-style waist belts, while leather riding boots were a particularly popular item that does keep cropping up in the Swedish and Dutch party correspondence. One letter that I think captures sort of sense of devotion to the party and all it entails quite well comes from 1935 to Messit after the party congress. The writer says, "I marched through Amsterdam, accompanied by police and gendarmerie, but also frequently past large groups of Amsterdam NSB members with flags and full of enthusiasm as a taster of the grand evening. The highlight for us, however, was to see the figure of our general leader in the far distance, strongly lit and high above thousands of devotees, as if on the bow of his flagship. Think back then to our little troop in Utrecht on that first party congress. But of course, the intimacy from back then had to disappear. Yet we felt then a different, greater intimacy between tens of thousands, a reflection of the comradeship of the entire united people. Now we felt ourselves to be well on our way there." End quote. The members of the NSAP and NSD were made to feel like they're immediately part of this world-changing force, sort of a soldier in a holy war or a builder of the great new nation. But these myths in which they participated and which they themselves helped produce in a way were simultaneously constructive of their social environment. By that I mean that sort of mutual understanding and positive social relationships for them became most feasible within the party environment. This was a tendency which was heavily reinforced by the regular so-called comrades evenings, which the Swedish fascists organized, where members came together in party locales and sang songs together, watched propaganda films and planned activities. Scholars of Dutch fascism have shown that NSD party houses were likewise places for socializing, even more so as the stigma of being a fascist grew massively in the later 30s, and NSD members found themselves increasingly isolated. As I reach the end of this talk, I hope this has clarified something about the abiding loyalty of thousands of Swedish and Dutch fascists on the street to their parties, to the leaders and their ideologies. While myths aren't really the only factor to explain the survivability of fascism, the fantastical narratives and imagery did provide a framework for a modicum of success and overcoming, or at least enduring, failures and setbacks. Also, there was nothing absolute about these myths, nothing innately all-encompassing. While they can sound impressive as described, the practical production of them required resources, finances, competencies, and opportunities, just like everything else. As such, they were prone to failure, they were subject to flaws and weaknesses, and they were incapable of drawing in and holding everyone who came in contact with them. Narratives of fascism, especially narratives of those fascisms which were more successful than the Swedish and Dutch, sometimes I think have a tendency to overstate the grandeur of its myths, the efficacy of the propaganda apparatuses. Viewing fascism from the perspective of the fascists helps us understand what attracted people to them, but it can make it harder to see where and how and why it failed. Fascism can then seem as a sort of irresistible force that was bound to seize the hearts and minds of millions and also bring devastation to much of the world. But in reality, it was no such thing. In essence, these fascisms were mediocre, ridiculous, and farcical. Fascism's own version of itself, its self-construction claimed otherwise, and was capable of generating fanatical devotion, as we've seen. But this was an active process that required effort, resources, and attention, and had to be constantly sustained. In Swedish and Dutch fascism, this active process was sustained with considerable difficulty and only a meager degree of success, which allowed the parties to survive and grow a little, but never truly flourish. The process could be disrupted and interrupted, and in most cases it was. In fact, you find that global history is littered with examples of fascist groups that did not survive, and they serve as important reminders that their support was contingent and success never guaranteed, no matter how much fascists overestimated their own significance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nathaniel. That was really fascinating, and particularly the sort of analysis of, I suppose, in a sense, the successes and failures, or the way in which some people were repelled and other people had this, in a sense, surprising level of loyalty to the movements. So if anyone has any questions in the audience, please put them in the chat. A question I just wondered about was how these movements are kind of remembered in Sweden and the Netherlands today. Is there much kind of historical memory of them?
In the Dutch case, there certainly is a lot of general historical memory, absolutely. The Second World War in particular, the period of occupation, is particularly well commemorated, I would say, and the notorious role of the NSD as a party of traitors and collaborators is very well known. Interestingly to me in the Netherlands is that among, for instance, neo-Nazis, it is not particularly well remembered because the parties seem to be so awkward, and Mesut is in many ways such an unappealing figure that they've proved to actually be very reluctant to engage with that history. In Sweden, on the other hand, none of the fascist parties of the interwar period or subsequently are particularly well remembered. There is some engagement with them in neo-Nazi circles, but generally it's not a very well-known history. You do see things crop up occasionally in the press about it, but there's really very little, I'd say, compared to most other countries.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Is it just maybe too much of a too contradictory of kind of Sweden's national image of itself, perhaps?
That's to some extent fair to say. Some of the sort of tendencies to see fascism as being alien to Sweden and not being relevant to its national history are absolutely there. And as recently, even at the beginning of the 21st century, historians started to say, we should study this. More people should engage with this. It is relevant. You can't just dismiss it as being alien to its history, because fascists have tried to show that sort of nonsense was part of a much greater European and even global phenomenon, and Sweden and the Netherlands weren't excluded from that in any way.
Yes, thank you. We've got a question from Paula, and she's saying thank you very much for the fascinating talk, and saying that she finds your analysis on the inward loyalty very convincing. Her question is about the impact of the movements on the general societies in both countries, even if they were not large and successful in elections. Did they maybe force nationalist or conservative parties to shift their rhetoric to the right?
Thank you, Paula. That's a very interesting, useful question. On the whole, I would say no. But so in the Swedish case, the issue is that the parties themselves, the parties I've been talking about, the fascists in the street, I don't think succeeded in that, because the kinds of groups and circles that were interested in fascism or Nazism in some way tended to be frequently such establishment circles, very upper class and aristocratic in Sweden, and they viewed these kind of brown-shirted thugs and views with a certain degree of distaste, it's fair to say, which isn't to say they weren't at all interested in fascism as such, and to say, they were interested in anti-Semitism, and they maintained contact with the Nazi state in Germany, for instance, but they basically bypassed the Swedish fascists in the street, as it were. They didn't think them to have any prospect. This wasn't much helped by the fact that Lindholm's idea of the National Socialist Workers' Party was as a sort of revolutionary workers' party, almost in a sort of pseudo-Marxian sense. He very much wanted to emphasize the left of fascism, the socialism and National Socialism in a lot of ways, which didn't appeal to a lot of the establishment right. Likewise, can't say that the NSB in the Netherlands particularly succeeded in pushing other right-wing parties further to the right, or much like that. And there was very much quite a gaping chasm between the kind of rhetoric the NSB used and what it stood for, and the conservative Christians who, for instance, in the Catholic case, tended to look more towards what was happening in Nazi Germany as an indication of what the NSB might do. So they were worried about the church struggle in Germany, and persecution of Catholics and things like that, and disregarded any more possibly positive message that could maybe be detected in the NSB. In short, no, but not to say that when plenty of reactionary, authoritarian and anti-Semitic attitudes prevalent, but they simply didn't really interact with these parties.
Okay, thank you. And Bruno's asking why you've sort of done this, in a sense, comparison. So was there a specific reason for the comparison between the Netherlands and Sweden?
Yes, I mean, the very blunt pragmatic answer is I have to speak both languages, so that seems awfully convenient. But more scholarly perspective, perhaps the issue is that we don't actually necessarily have all that much research on fascism in some of these smaller countries. So much of the analysis in scholarship, at least for a long time, about fascism in Europe has revolved around things like participation in the First World War, the fact that fascism emerged in countries where perhaps democracy was still very new or unstable in various ways. So I'm very interested in focusing instead on these small liberal democracies where that didn't apply. Perhaps there are other more arguably logical comparisons, like between Sweden and Denmark and Norway, for instance. But then I find you end up with more knowledge about what fascism was in Scandinavia, and perhaps something you can extrapolate a bit more from.
Yes, thank you. And Annika is asking a question about, I suppose, the background of supporters and members and sympathisers of the fascist movements you've looked at. So was their particular class background or geographical locations, countryside, city, and so on, any regions which were more fascist than others?
Yeah, for sure. In the Netherlands, the cities were much greater strongholds of fascism. The city of Amsterdam, for instance, saw approximately 10%, even greater at times, for the NSB, whereas it was only a bit weaker in the countryside. There was some, interestingly, there was some strength in the south of the Netherlands as well, in places like Limburg and Brabant, which were very Catholic regions. So it does seem that for a while the NSB managed to actually attract Catholics, particularly Catholic workers who were dissatisfied with the Roman Catholic Party. But that was never very far going. In Sweden, I actually have a similar picture that the support seems to be greatest in the large cities like Gothenburg and Stockholm. In Gothenburg, it was something like 5% of the vote in municipal elections, which, well, not impressive in any way. It's far greater than what it's managed to attain in national elections. Otherwise, it's much more sparse. So you see like individual little villages, for instance, in the far north, where like the entire village seems to be voting fascist, but then nothing else around there. So it's much more difficult to see patterns as well.
Okay, thank you. And then a question I think might be the final question. So Alan is asking how you account for the recent popularity of the Swedish Democrats, who have historical links to neo-Nazi roots, and do you see any similarities between Geert Wilders and Anton Mussert?
I'll start with the latter, where I think the answer is a short no. I don't see any similarities between them. They both in terms of personality. I'm not I'm by no means an expert on Geert Wilders, fair to say, but I don't see them as having any sort of similarities. They conduct politics in completely different ways, and Mussert was trying to build a mass party, whereas Geert Wilders doesn't even really run a proper party. He runs a sort of one-man organization of which he is the leader technically, and he does as he pleases. It's a very different kind of situation, so I don't think they compare very well. As for the Sweden Democrats, yes, very right that they do actually have roots in sort of the neo-Nazi movement. That actually goes back a long way, and actually it is possible to sort of draw a direct line between, for instance, the Swedish fascists of the 1930s to the Sweden Democrats today in terms of personnel and organizational connections. Accounting for that, well, I don't think there's much specifically about Sweden that accounts for the rise of the Sweden Democrats, in the sense that it's Sweden that's subject to the same issues and problems as much of the globe seems to be at the moment. So I think you'd have to use some kind of analytical framework to explain the rise of Sweden Democrats' dissatisfaction with how, well, in the wake of financial crisis in 2008 and dissatisfaction with immigration issues, things like that. What I can say though is that some of this success is how they've managed to quite successfully suppress the idea that they are some kind of neo-fascist and neo-Nazi party. They do have these direct links to neo-Nazi movements. It's clear that a lot of their membership and even leaders within the party are really hold basically Nazi ideas, but they have managed to reinvent themselves and definitely a new image, which is something fascism has always been doing. It's mentioned when the NSAP in Sweden in 1938 with this new direction and suddenly ditched the name National Socialist Party to instead be the Swedish Socialists, and no longer use the swastika, stuff like that. That's basically the same kind of tactic, saying, oh, we have nothing to do with fascism, we are a proper Swedish party, we don't do any of that stuff, we're not extremists. The only difference is that I think well, there are lots of differences, but one of the differences is that the Sweden Democrats are doing so at a time when that is much more viable, and they're riding a much bigger international wave, and they're perhaps doing so rather more skillfully.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you all for really excellent questions. Thanks so much to Nathaniël for a great talk and responding to the questions so well. If you're in Britain, and particularly around the London area, the exhibition of which this is a part is open at least till the 6th of February. It looks like we might extend it slightly to mid-February, so do come along if you can. So thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope to see you again at Wiener Holocaust Library events. So I'll be ending the event shortly. It ends rather abruptly because I just closed the Zoom. So thanks everyone, and see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.